Good evening, viewers, and welcome to another edition of My Take. I would like to thank those of you who look forward to this program with me. I try to do this at least twice every month, the first Monday and the last Monday of every month. May not be consistent based on my schedule, but nevertheless, we're here this evening. So, as you know, the reason why I do this show is really to review what happened during the period between when we had the last show to now. And 99% of my time is consumed in looking at issues in the public domain, what is happening in the economy, public financial issues, economic issues. And as usual, there is never any moment when there is nothing that I don't have to deal with, in the sense that there are 100% or 90% or 80% accurate information, factual information being reported in certain sections of the media. So everybody has some agenda, and everybody, they report, they sensationalize, they misrepresent, and especially during election season. So, having said that brief background, let's get right into what I want to talk to you about today. If the operator could bring up the screen. Quick. So, the last time I had this program, you would recall I spent some time to present to you my take on a particular interview with a professor and the publisher of Kaicho News. And I would have predicted that the contents of that interview, based on what the professor said, would have been used to lend credence or to validate certain positions, certain narrative by that particular publisher. And so said, so done. If you review the newspapers from then to now, you will see every day there is some bits and pieces based on what that professor said. But what is the facts? The fact is, the interview was more or less not different from a classroom lecture, and it is divorced from reality because the professor evidently, if you review that interview, and you don't have to be a scholar to deduce this. The average person could deduce, if you listen to the professor, he has absolutely no knowledge of Guyana. He has absolutely no experience and knowledge of what is the situation in Guyana. And surprisingly, for a professor of his caliber, knowing that he is being interviewed by the host of that interview is the publisher of the widest independent newspaper circulating in the country, at minimum, you want to examine the country, you want to do some amount of studies in the country, because nobody is invited for an interview just to come and speak and you don't know what is the topic. Even me, those of you who pay attention to current affairs would know that you would see me appearing on many interviews, many discussion panels, many different forums. And those forums, you're not invited just to speak and you don't know what you're speaking about. You are told beforehand what is the topic. Sometimes you're even told what are the questions that will be thrown to you that the host would like to have answered. So you have some time to prepare. So that was evidently not done by the professor. And so it was more of a gaffing session. Yet, the publisher took all that he has said in a gospel fashion and sought to integrate that to validate certain narratives, to say that these argumentations by this professor are more or less the situation in Guyana. That is not so. I would have spent some time in the last program to dissect that, but I just want to begin by stating, as I have predicted, that is exactly what has happened. Now, if you could pull up back on the screen, operator. Yeah. Now let's look at this situation. So the vice president held this press conference last week, and at the end of the press conference, during the Q&A session, as usual, the Kaichor News reporters asked certain questions in relation to the oil and gas sector. Now, the question was asked whether the royalty, as you can see in the front page there, is recoverable. And the vice president responded that it should not be recoverable, and he said to the reporter that check with a trained accountant to explain to you that financial statements are prepared in accordance with certain conventions. And he's correct, because the convention that financial statements are prepared in line with, in the case of Ghana, is called the International Financial Reporting Standards, IFRS, right? So because it has to be prepared in that manner, it does not reflect what is in the production sharing agreement, the terms in the production sharing agreement. And what are the terms in the production sharing agreement? The terms in the production sharing agreement is 50% profit, 2% royalty, 75% cost recovery ceiling, not the cost recovery ceiling. So now here we have a front page headline. The vice president is unsure if ExxonMobil is recovering 2% royalty in expenses. Now, I particularly want to bring this to your attention because it is totally disingenuous of this newspaper. And the reason why it is totally disingenuous is because, and let me show you the facts now, this has been a long-standing burning issue since last year by this particular media house, and the clarification has already been given since last year, and the agency with the authority to give this clarification issued a press release. And here again you have this issue repeating itself. Now let me show you the facts here. Let me go now to, this is the Guyana Revenue website, and if you go on your Google, you would find that this press release was published in Starbreak News and all the other media houses. I don't know, I didn't see it in Kaichor News. Maybe they deliberately, as usual, did not carry it. So if you look, this is GRA website. You look here at the date, the topic, royalty payments to Guyana government, June 27, 2022. Now let's read the specific parts. I'm not going to read the entire press release. You can go and Google it for yourself and read it. But now let's read what this statement is saying. So, for context, the authority has noted that notwithstanding the several contracts signed, the emphasis is on the one entered into between Esso Exploration and Production Guyana Limited, CNOC, and Hess Guyana Limited, hereinafter collectively referred to as the contractor, and the Guyana government, and apparently so since presently Stabroek is the sole producing block in Guyana. That being said, the GRA wishes to advise as follows. 1. In the said articles and conversations, and the articles and conversations here that this press release is referring to is the articles published by the Kaichor News during this time on this specific exact matter. It says, in the said articles and conversations, there is failure to distinguish between the petroleum tax regime and the petroleum cost recovery regime. So there's two things. There's the petroleum tax regime. What is the tax regime? The tax regime is what is prescribed in the production sharing agreement. That is the 50-50 profit split, the 2% royalty, and the 75% cost recoverable ceiling. That is the petroleum tax regime. And then you have the petroleum cost recovery regime. Under Article 15.6 of the PSA under review, the contractor pays a royalty of 2% to the Guyana government on the value of all petroleum produced and sold. 3. This item royalty is not explicitly mentioned as cost recoverable under Annex C, Section 3.1, without further approval of the Minister, or 3.2, with approval of the Minister. Further, it is not mentioned under Section 3.3 of Annex C as a cost not recoverable under the agreement. Even though Section 3.4 of Annex C vests the power in the Minister to determine the recoverability of an expense not covered under the provisions of Section 3, such discretion has not been exercised by the Minister relative to royalty. For the public's information, Section 3.4 of Annex C reads as follows: Other costs and expenses not covered or dealt with in the provisions of this Section 3 and which are incurred by the contractor in the conduct of petroleum operations are recoverable, subject to the approval of the Minister. Emphasis is added there, approval of the Minister. Article 11.2 and 11.4 delineate the methodology for the sharing of profit oil between the contractor and the government, with costs being limited to 75% of the total revenue from the sale of petroleum each month. Provision is made for costs exceeding the 75% cap to be carried forward to successive months until recouped. This allows for the present 12.5% profit share being allocated to the government in the interim until all costs carried forward are recovered. So you see, this is a very detailed press statement by GRA. Now let me look for the specific part where he says the royalty is not recoverable. For the sake of repetition, the 2% royalty paid to the Guyana government is not a cost in determining Guyana's share of profit oil, but is an expense in determining the contractor's taxable income. The GRA's mandate is to administrate tax legislation and government agreements for the benefit of all stakeholders in a fair and consistent manner. I trust that the above lends clarity. So all this, fancy language where the Commissioner General of GRA issued this press release was in response to this burning question since last year, which is now repeating itself. Simply to clarify that the royalty is not cost recoverable. Yet we have this huge misleading headline. You see why I can't stop doing these things? Now, with that said, I see opponents of the government have resuscitated this old argument again, that the government, when they were in opposition, have said, and obviously you see these things re-emerging during election period, and that is understandable. So let's deal with the proper context and facts. Now, what am I referring to? There's some snippets of video circulating in sections of social media, certain forums, that the government, President Ali, when he was presidential candidate, when the government was in opposition benches, and the vice president as opposition leader, has said that when they come into government, that they will renegotiate the oil contracts. And so a huge section of society, largely led by the likes of the publisher of Kaichur News et al., that The government has not stood up to that promise. Now, that is, again, totally inaccurate. So, let me explain. It is true, and this is verifiable. You can go on YouTube this, that the government, that the vice president and the president, when they were in opposition, they did say that when they come into government, that they will change those all contracts, and they would, in fact, an interview with the Guyanese. I saw an interview with the Guyanese critic and President Ali in February of 2020, just before elections, where he said we have to relook at the entire framework, that the government, that his government, once elected, will relook at the entire oil and gas framework, not just the contract. What has the government done since it came to office in 2020? So the facts are, one, and these are some important contexts that you should understand. And during the course of this week, I will do a special article on local content. But let me explain, first of all, and then you will understand what the government really meant. We will look at the entire framework, not just the contracts. When in 2015, leading up to 2016, 2017, the Private Sector Association started to call for local content framework, a local content policy. Now, the former government, under the former Minister Trotman, when he was Natural Resource Minister, they came up with three draft local content policy. And I would have written extensively on these, critiquing them during that period. The first draft I discredited as an academic paper, but it was not a practical policy document. It was full of fluff. Nothing practical that to show how you're going to implement this policy, how we're going to achieve targets and so on. Total fluff. The second draft was a slightly improved version, but again, nothing of substance. And the consultation was not done in the manner in which the current government, when they got into office, how the consultation was done. There was a series of consultation which lasted for about 1 year before all of that information, through consultations with all the stakeholders, were fed into developing the local content bill, then local content legislation. The consultation by the former government was one, the stakeholders were invited to make submissions. And guess what? Because I was part of these consultations and I have made submissions, substantive submissions on behalf of the private sector. I was at the Private Sector Commission that time. And absolutely nothing, when the draft came out following our submissions, absolutely nothing that we have submitted were considered. Absolutely nothing. So the third draft was the worst, and that made me more upset, because the third draft policy by the former government, which was the last version they left, it categorically stated that at this time, this local content policy is designed for the upstream sector. Now, what this really means is a slap in our face, the entire country's face, because the upstream sector is offshore, where ExxonMobil and their co-venture partners are operating. And we do not have the knowledge, we do not have the technology, we do not have the capability, we do not have The financial resources, we do not have the experience to build out the upstream sector. The upstream sector is for the ExxonMobil and the Shell and the Chevrons and the Tolous and all and Total and all those foreign companies that have upstream experience, who could explore and drill and find the resource in commercial quantities and have the capability to develop it and have the financial resources to develop it. So what that means is this is not a local content policy. This simply means this is a policy that is designed to not develop any local content at all. Fortunately, there was a change of government, and then we had a proper local content legislation which is focused on what are the low-hanging fruits. What can we do? There are over 200 or 300 goods and services required in the oil and gas industry. So there is the upstream sector, there is the midstream sector, and there is the downstream sector. The midstream sector, this is how the sector is structured. You have the midstream where that connects the downstream to the upstream. That is your shipping, the port, the shore bases, transportation, that's the midstream. The logistics, that's in the midstream sector. And we have capabilities there. We have capabilities in logistics. Yeah, and then you have the downstream now, where we are now building out the downstream sector, the gas to shore, building out the gas to shore, refinery and all of that. That's the downstream side, right? So we have to build out the infrastructure, catering services, supplying all these goods and services so that we have local capability. So that's the first thing which the government did, which is part of the framework which they said they're going to do, the entire framework. The first thing, local content. Local content today, what is the result? As a result of that local content legislation, because the oil companies, listen, anyways, I'll talk about this another on the next edition. But even though we have the local content legislation, we are still not getting what we're supposed to get. The oil companies are still finding a way to, to shortchange us. And I'll deal with this matter specifically, extensively at another forum. So, and if you do not legislate what you want in the local content, if you do not legislate, the oil companies are not obligated to do anything. So this is the importance of the legislation. So as a result of the local content, a proper local content legislation, we are now able to benefit from $1 billion more in local content spend in the country. $1 billion more annually. And that amount will grow as we continue to build our capacity, improve our capabilities, improve our quality of services, and so on. What does that translate to? It translates to training and development for our local workforce, knowledge transfer, technology transfer, local companies having the opportunity to supply the industry and benefit from that and grow from that. They in turn create employment and the full works. Okay, so from that resource, because of local content, we can now get an additional $1 billion a year, $1 billion a year, or 200 billion Ghana dollars a year, an additional $200 billion because of that piece of legislation, in addition to the production sharing agreement, profit share, and 2% royalty. So that's the first thing they did. Remember the entire framework. Secondly, in fact, simultaneously, the government sought to, so the former government, they passed the Natural Resource Fund Bill. It became the Natural Resource Fund Act. That was questionable, and you know the whole story about the lack of transparency, the excessive control by the minister. And the way that act was designed is to draw down most of the money towards the end, rather than draw down the money from the beginning at the outset, where it is needed the most, where when it is needed the most to build out our infrastructure to support the growth of the economy and all the other sectors, which is important as well to avoid the Dutch disease, which we talk about many times on this program. So local content was done. Natural Resource Fund Act was amended. That's the second thing. What's the third thing? The third thing is the production sharing agreement. There is a brand new model developed, which is currently being looked at. It was issued to the public for consultations. The opposition still can't supply their feedback on it. And the new fiscal terms in that new draft model, in that new model PSA, is we've kept the 50%, the 50-50 share. Royalty has gone up to 10%. There is now a 10% corporate tax. And the cost recovery ceiling came down from 75 to 65%, which is altogether designed to increase our take. Now, the contention by Kaichur News et al. Is that why not apply to the Stabroek block, the current Stabroek block. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about that on previous programs and writings. I don't want to regurgitate that. But what is important to note is that new, and what the government said in opposition is exactly what they're doing. That they will renegotiate those contracts, because it's not only the Stabroek block contract. There are 9 other active exploration licenses that will eventually move to production once there is commercial finding. It's just that ExxonMobil is the first to hit oil in commercial discovery in commercial quantities in 2015, but there are 9 other oil blocks other than the Stabroek block, which Exxon is involved in as well. And so automatically those 9 other exploration licenses, when they're ready to move to production, will automatically be renegotiated, because they are working under the same fiscal terms of the Stabroek block 2016 PSA. So effectively that has been renegotiated. In addition to that, what is important to note is that, yes, the Stabroek block is the largest oil block and the most viable so far, proven reserves so far. The fact of the matter is, and nobody talks about this, is the production sharing agreement has a life. It is not a perpetual agreement. It has a life, which means it will expire at some point in the future. And if I'm not mistaken, the life of that production sharing agreement is 30 years. So if you look at all the proven reserve, right now the proven reserve is over 11 billion barrels. So it's more than 11 billion barrels. And if you do some simple calculations, based on what you know where production will peak by 2030, Exxon would not be able to extract all of the resources in the Stabroek block, which means the current production sharing agreement may very well expire. And so when it expires, you still have billions more of proven reserve that has not been extracted, that you can now apply the new fiscal terms. Right? Then what else is the government doing? Brand new Petroleum Act and a whole host of other things in the capacity building, in terms of capacity building to manage the sector, investing in the EPA, for example, in improving capacity, the Ministry of Natural Resources, Guyana Revenue Authority, oil responses, training, and all of that. So the government didn't say anything in opposition that it is not doing. They said that they're going to look at the entire framework, and that is exactly what they have done. So I think I said enough for tonight. I don't want to overwhelm you with information, and so let me see if there is any questions I can deal with in the commentary. All right, I haven't seen any question in particular. So I think I've said enough for tonight's edition. Thank you for joining this program. Thank you for watching, and see you again before the end of the month.